All right. Now that we've had our preamble on some early thoughts on your rights and obligations as a photojournalist, let's get into some specifics about where your rights lead you as far as where you're able to shoot and what you're able to take pictures of, etc. We're going to call this the 10 Commandments of Photojournalism Rights. And like I said, they largely have to deal with your rights as a photographer and largely based on your own physical being, where you're able to be and legally how that connects to your rights as a photographer. We're going to split this video into two, just so you know. So there'll be ultimately 3 parts in the Know Your Rights segment. So the first of our rights is this, or the rights commandments, is that when you're in the public space or when you are out in the public, it means that you can take a picture of just about anything or anyone. And that comes down to our understanding of the definition of what we call a public space. Note that a public space is different than public property or private property. Let's make sure we're keeping that definition distinct and clear. The issue is that when we hear the term public space, what we hear is public or municipal. We think about something like a public park or a state park or something that's owned by the government. Now what you're thinking about there is actually public property. This is public space. A public space is kind of everywhere. A public space is the sidewalks in front of your house or the sidewalks that wind through the city. It's shopping malls and strip malls. It's most stores and grocery stores that you may go to. It's the university that you happen to be in. It's pretty much everywhere that you go to shop. It is everywhere you may go out to get a drink or to eat dinner. It is a public space. These are not all publicly owned. Some of these are private property, but they are public spaces. A public space is a space where, or a place where, you don't need an invitation to be there. It is where an invitation is not reasonably expected in order for you to be there. Note again that a public space is different than public property or private property. We're not talking about ownership here. We're talking about the legal ability to be there. So a shopping mall, for example, is a public space. Even though it's private property, the mall itself is usually owned by a real estate company or is owned by a management company, and each of the individual stores are owned by that particular company. The mall itself and the stores are all public spaces. And that's because you don't need an invitation to go to the mall. You don't have to sign up for some sort of membership. You don't have to get an invitation in the mail. You don't have to fill out any paperwork in order to go to the mall. You just take the bus or drive your car, you park, you go in, and you're in the mall. Which means that you are able to go to the mall, to pull out a camera, and start taking pictures of things or people. And that includes stuff like grocery stores. It includes anything that you may be in a public space to take a picture. So again, let's think about this in terms of Walmart. You don't need a written invitation to go to Walmart. You simply need to show up and walk in the Walmart. So you're allowed to go in and start taking pictures in Walmart. Now that doesn't mean that if you take your camera, you go to Walmart and you start taking pictures, that somebody who works at the Walmart or the manager who works at the Walmart, it doesn't mean that they're not going to tell you you have to leave. And if they tell you you have to leave, guess what? You do have to leave. Despite most businesses being public spaces in that you don't have to have an invitation to be there, and you are then allowed to take pictures there, business owners can also set their own rules for the place. More on that in a second. And they can kick you out if they see you taking pictures. Once they kick you out, if they tell you you're not allowed to come back, then don't. Because what's going to happen is they will then call the police, and it'll be trespassing because you have been told to leave. Now, keep in mind, let's say, theoretically, you go to Walmart, you start taking photographs. The manager of the Walmart comes out and tells you, hey, you have to leave, you're not allowed to take pictures here. They're not allowed to tell you you have to delete those photos. I mean, they can tell you that. You don't have to listen to them. They're not allowed to physically touch you anyway or harass you. But what they can do is tell you you have to leave now. And if they tell you that, then you do have to leave, and you can't come back because, again, then you'll be in the wrong because it's trespassing. Just as a quick side note, if you're at a public meeting, a municipal meeting, something like a city council meeting or a county commission meeting, if you are physically getting in the way of the meeting itself, they can tell you to sit down. So, for example, let's say you are in the way of the projector they're trying to use to look at a chart, or you're blocking the view of a speaker who's talking and the person who's trying to listen to them. They can then tell you to go sit down in the back. That's fine. Usually they can't kick you out. But they're allowed to set the rules in that situation. But please keep in mind the main point of this first one here, which is that a public space is any place where you can be without an invitation, and that a public space is open for photography. You're allowed to go and take pictures, but that doesn't stop you from getting kicked out if that's the case. That leads us to number 2, which is when you're on private property, the owner of the property then gets to make the rules regarding if the pictures are allowed or not. So this is the difference between public space and private property. Public spaces can exist on private property, and if that's the case, then the owner gets to say, hey, you know what, no photography here. So it could be that in the mall there's a sign that says, hey, no pictures. I don't think that would actually be the case because pretty much everybody has a smartphone nowadays, but that could be the case. So ways this works, right? Private homes. If someone tells you when you enter their home, hey, no pictures here, then you really shouldn't take pictures there because they're allowed to say, hey, no, don't do that. That's not right. Now, as a photographer, the way that this comes into play in a more tangible way is stuff like in sports photography. If you are going to take pictures of a golf tournament, for example. A golf tournament exists on a golf course. Golf courses are usually private property, and so the owner of the golf course or the manager of the particular golf tournament may make a rule for photographers saying, hey, if you're going to take pictures at this tournament, you need to have your camera in a noise box. This is a picture of a noise box. It's a little gray box or a black box that you put your camera in, and then you close the door on, and it's soundproof. So when you snap the photograph, the sound of the shutter, which as we know from learning how cameras work, the mirror is actually snapping up the shutters opening, closing, and the mirror coming down again. That actually blocks the noise of that. And if you've ever used an SLR, you know it makes a little noise. It doesn't sound like much, but if you have 50 photographers all taking pictures at once, it can get distracting. And golfers are really weird and need total silence. And the same thing with concert venues. You'll find that concert venues may have rules set up for photographers saying that you're not allowed to use long lenses. Or if you have a professional photography setup or you are shooting for a newspaper or something, you're allowed to take pictures only in this area, or only for the first 3 songs, and then you have to go to the back or something like that. They're allowed to set the rules because they own the area, but you're allowed to go in and take pictures. And ultimately not complying with the demands of the owner of the property, again, can lead to you being kicked out. If you show up to the golf tournament without your sound box and you start taking pictures and one of the golfers complains, they can, of course, kick you off the golf course, and you need to listen to them. It is important to know that if you're breaking any other laws while you're in the process of taking pictures, you're still breaking those laws. So if the owner of the property tells you to scram and you don't leave, and you leave and you come back, just because you're taking pictures doesn't mean you're not breaking the law. It means that you can be arrested for trespassing, which is not fun for anybody. However, please note that the owner of private property is not allowed to take your camera, and they cannot make you delete your photographs. Under no circumstances should you ever hand your gear over to anybody else. So let's say you're taking pictures in a store. The owner of the store comes over and says, hey, you have to leave, you have to get out of here, no pictures here, and you say, all right, I'm going to leave, and they say, I need you to delete any of the pictures you took here. You do not listen to them, you just simply leave. If they try to grab your stuff, or they try to take your camera from you through force, you should step out and call the police. Number 3, if you're in a public space, you can take pictures of private property. This is the combining of our first two thoughts together. So we know that public spaces are places where you're allowed to take pictures because it's a place that doesn't require an invitation. And private property is a place where someone gets to set the rules, which means that if you're in one, you can take pictures of the other. We sort of call this the sidewalk rule. This will make sense in a second, but sidewalks are public spaces, and so you're almost always allowed to be on the sidewalk. So let's say you want to take photos of the front of a business, but they kick you out. What you have to do is walk to the sidewalk, because they don't own the sidewalk. The sidewalk is always going to be public. Stand on the sidewalk and take their picture from there. I had a friend one time who I was working with at the newspaper who there had been a shooting at a nightclub. We really wanted, no one had been hurt, but we really wanted pictures because there was bullet holes in the glass from the front of the club. So the photographer went to the club, started taking pictures. The club owner came out and kicked him out. And so what he did in response was walk to the sidewalk, which is about 10 feet away from the front of the club, stood on the sidewalk and took the pictures from there. The club owner wasn't very happy, but there's nothing really they could do about it. This can make people angry sometimes if you're taking pictures of their private property from a public space. Please know that you do need to consider the ethics of this sometimes. More on that in a second. But if someone becomes hostile or aggressive with you, if you ever feel like you're threatened, if you ever feel like they're going to hurt you, if they ever try to take your camera, if they ever try to destroy or break your stuff, you really need to call the police at that point. You are going to be the one legally in the right, and so you need to make sure that you are defending yourself in the safest and most legal way possible, which is to avoid confrontation and then call the police. Number 4, some public places. So some places that are government owned, and we're going to call this public property in this situation. Some public property is actually allowed to be very, very private, despite the fact it's owned by the government. And this is places like power plants, for example. A lot of power plants are government owned, but power plants have legal exclusions saying, hey, you're not allowed to take pictures inside of them. Some government facilities, like the Pentagon is a really good example. You're not allowed to take pictures in the Pentagon, or in most of the Pentagon. And that's because of national security issues and safety issues. However, it's important to know that these places are going to be clearly marked. If you're not allowed to take pictures there, there's going to be signs clearly indicating you're not allowed to take pictures there. So you'll have signs up saying, warning, photography in this area is prohibited. And then it'll have the name of the statute, legal statute, underneath the photo, underneath the sign saying, hey, this is why photography is not allowed in this area. They're going to be clearly marked. Just make sure that you're looking for the signs, and usually this will be obvious. However, there are some places where you may think that there are no photography allowed, or people may tell you that there's no photography allowed because of safety concerns. But that's not actually the case. So don't let people use safety concerns, quote unquote, as a reason to kick you out of somewhere that's not restricted if you have legal access to be there. Airports have been the battle zone for this. You are allowed to take pictures in an airport through the entire time. From the first time you walk in, to photos of the front area, photos of security, photos of baggage check, and photos of the gate. This has been a situation where the TSA has been largely unaware of the fact that photography is allowed, so people have gone in to do stories about the TSA, have taken pictures, and have been kicked out by the TSA. This is actually how one of the ways in which Carlos Miller, author of our textbook, has used his site, Photography is Not a Crime, to really push the issue forward to make sure the TSA is aware of the fact that you're allowed to take pictures in airports and you're allowed to take pictures of security screens in airports. So you are allowed to be there. You're allowed to take pictures of the entire process, and so make sure that you're aware of the fact that some people may try to say, hey, you can't do that, and legally you are actually allowed to. It doesn't help that most of the public service stuff that went out after the terrible events of 9/11 had stuff to do with photographers. So it would have posters being put up in airports that says, "Don't let our planes get into the wrong hands." And of course, the nefarious person in the photograph is a photographer with a hoodie on taking pictures of an airplane. Taking pictures of airplanes is kind of just a hobby for some people. They're not all scary and nefarious. Number 5, this will wrap up our video, the first part of our 5-point video on photography rights. That is that people can be photographed if they're in a public space, with or without their consent, unless they have secluded themselves and can expect a reasonable degree of privacy. So essentially, if someone's in a public space, meaning that they're in an area where it doesn't require specific invitation to be in, then they are able to have their photograph taken and published without their permission. Now that seems wrong, or that seems scary, but that is the rule. And this does include children. You do not need the permission of a parent to take the picture or publish the picture of a child. Now, that is where you really need to consider the ethics of it, right? There's some situations where, hey, you know what? Just because legally you can take the picture doesn't mean that you should take the picture. You should consider that, hey, maybe the parent doesn't want their kid's photograph everywhere. Maybe they are trying to hide from somebody. Maybe they've been in a situation where they need to have a low profile. So it's just always more polite. Even though you're legally able to, it's just more polite. But think about situations where you might not want to be hovering around with a camera. Ethically and legally, where someone might have some expectation of privacy. Like if someone's at the ATM trying to withdraw cash, hovering around taking their pictures might be legal, but you also are kind of a jerk and you're making them really uncomfortable. If someone's getting medical treatment from EMT, especially in an outdoor area, like, yeah, you can snap their picture, but, you know, maybe consider doing it in a way that isn't embarrassing for them, isn't going to cause undue distress for them, where you're not interfering with the EMTs trying to help somebody. And overall, just don't be exploitive with it. You should also consider the lenses you're using. If you're using a really high zoom lens, you could probably get into areas where someone might have a reasonable expectation of privacy. But just take a second and think, hey, ethically, should I be doing this? Versus, hey, I'm legally able to do this. It all comes down to this basic idea, which is the expectation of privacy. Is the person who is being photographed, do you believe in their mind that they are expecting that photograph to be taken? And you need to, if the answer is no, it doesn't mean that you don't take the photograph, but it does mean that you should consider the ramifications of it before you publish it. Because oftentimes this is going to go back to the consideration of ethics with the situation involving any of these scenarios, especially stuff involving kids, involving people who are receiving medical treatment, etc. It's a good idea to think about it. Think about, hey, am I causing unneeded stress or harm to somebody by photographing them in what they think is private? I think this is a big deal, especially for private citizens and not for public officials. If it's a politician, if it's a business, sort of a large-scale business person, if it's someone who is a public figure, I'm a little bit less sort of understanding of it. But if it's a private citizen, you do need to consider what is the ramifications of taking the photograph that they're unaware of in a public space. Okay, this is part 2 of our knowing our rights, and I will see you all in part 3.